Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Millie. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you've thoroughly enjoyed these last 2 days. They have been fascinating and stimulating. If it's cocktail hour where you are, you should be. Please raise a glass to your colleagues. So welcome back. This is the last, but by no means least, presentation of the day and indeed the conference. Managing Assets One Day at a Time at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. This is kind of a day in the life type of presentation, something I think we can all relate to. So think of it maybe as a reality show episode. Digital Asset Managers of the Smithsonian. Here for our session is Judith Andrews. Judith is the Digital Asset Manager of the Smithsonian Institution, National Museum of American History and Culture. So Judith, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Judith Andrews. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with blue hair. I'm wearing a colored scarf and brown glasses. I would like to start by saying that, acknowledging that I live and work on the traditional homelands of the Piscataway and the Anacostan people around Washington, D.C. I would like to recognize and honor their elders, past, present, and emerging, and thank them for the traditional knowledge that they've imparted to me when I have had interactions with today's Piscataway people. I may slide into using acronyms during this talk, and I would like y'all to keep me honest. I do plan to tell you what every acronym means. It's something we do at the Smithsonian and in the government. We use a lot of acronyms. So if there's any acronym that I use that I don't define, please go ahead and throw that in the Q&A, and we can get to it during the chat afterwards. So as the digital asset manager at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, there's our first acronym. I'm going to call it NMAAHC. I expect that some of you will find a lot in common with what I do every day. So this is kind of what I do on a recurring basis, on a regular basis. And that's going to be the focus of what you'll see today. I will also say that as of right now, I have done something from every category that I'm going to be telling you about today, already just today, even though I've also been attending this event. So our first slide is managing assets one day at a time with Judith Andrews, Digital Asset Manager. On the left-hand side of the screen is a photograph of the interior of the museum building, where our stairwell opens up through all three levels, and you can see light pouring in from the windows. On my next slide, there are no photos, but there is a corona pattern, which is our pattern on the outside of the museum in purple, covering 2/3 of the image. So where do I fit in? Digital asset management is needed everywhere and always. So I'm going to give you, on our next slide, there are no pictures, but it's a quick organizational locator of where do I fit in within the museum, within the Smithsonian. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I'm located in the Office of Curatorial Affairs, otherwise known as OCA, and I'm inside the digitization and cataloging team, also called DigiTeam. But who do I work with on a regular basis? I work with DigiTeam staff, our Rights and Reproductions Manager. I am also a Rights and Reproduction Specialist, as well as the DAMS Manager for NMAAHC. I work with imaging specialists and photographers every day. I work with our collections information specialists. I work with our catalogers, and I work with leadership of the Digi team. I also work with a lot of OCA staff, the collections management specialists, the registrars, curatorial staff, our media conservation team, and our archive staff. Less frequently, but still on a pretty regular basis, I do work with a lot of people throughout NMAAHC, as well as at the Central Smithsonian DAMS team. Our digital asset management system, we call the DAMS. We have a central team of 7 who work in OCIO. It's the Office of the Chief Information Officer, which is a separate division at the Smithsonian. Every division at the Smithsonian, we call it a unit. That is some Smithsonian specific jargon if you haven't worked with the Smithsonian lately. I also work with digital asset managers Smithsonian-wide. Every unit at the Smithsonian has somebody who is doing digital asset management. And we do talk to each other to find out what everybody's doing, to figure through problems, and to see where we can all succeed together. My next slide, what is a typical day? We go back, there's no picture on this slide, but I do again have the purple corona pattern that's on the outside of the museum. So what is a typical day? Otherwise known as my main duties. So I do dams management. I am the point of contact for the Smithsonian dams for NMAAHC. On the left-hand side, you can see a screenshot of some of the security policies that we use at NMAAHC in our dams. The user roles, security policies, and user administration is one of the main things I do with working with people throughout NMAAHC. We have a variety of user roles. You can maybe just read access. Maybe you can read and ingest. Maybe you can read, ingest, and export. The security policies match up with our different user groups. And so this is something that it's very cyclical. So I may not do something with the user with any of this on a daily basis, but it is very, it happens a lot. I also train and create tutorials and assist dams users in whatever they need in the dams. We do, thankfully, from the Smithsonian Central Dams team, have a good set of training materials that are pre-recorded, but those are how to use the dams generally. The NMAAHC use of dams is very, we have customized what we're doing with it to make it work for us, since it is a larger system that we are one unit of many using. Currently the Smithsonian Central Dams is approximately 3.5 petabytes, and we have just shy of 5 million assets in the NMAAHC dams section. So we do have quite a large footprint in the dams. I also work with a standing working group on NMAAHC policies for using the dams. What is our standard file naming convention? What are we going to do with new user groups, and how are we going to be using it across the museum, collections, public affairs, exhibitions? Each of them might have a different way that they need to be using the dams. And so we manage that. The next slide has no picture. And I talk about imaging, digitization, and access. The Digi team is in charge of imaging the physical collections in the archives, documenting exhibits, and event photography when it's requested. I am part of that process. I am the final QC before dams ingest happens, quality check QC. What we want to make sure is that everything that we have standard for our minimal required metadata is embedded in the imaging of the physical collections and archives before we ingest it into the dams. I don't know if your dam system is like ours, but once it's been ingested, embedded metadata cannot be changed. And we want to make sure that all of it is correct before the ingest takes place. So post ingest, I do a quality check on a lot of our systems so that they can crosswalk appropriately. We have a central image delivery service, IDS, at the Smithsonian that can take images from the dams and deliver images in certain places. We are currently working on a video asset delivery service. It's not yet live, but that is in the process. We have our CDIS, also known as the Collection Dams Information System. And that allows us to sync assets between the dams into the variety of CIS's collection information systems that the Smithsonian uses. So in my case, I want to make sure that what I ingested into dams shows up in the other systems using the CDIS sync. Smithsonian also has an open access initiative that we launched in February of 2020. So I want to make sure that any open access or CC0 Creative Commons 0 licensing images that I ingest into the dams, I want to make sure that in our weekly export from the dams to the server outside of our firewall where the open access images can be downloaded from, I want to make sure that that export happened correctly and that all of my images processed correctly. I also am in charge of file retention and purging. Of course, we're creating all of these assets, and we don't have an enumerable footprint in our local network. So we do have to purge. Last week, I purged about 1.1 terabytes of old imaging that had been ingested to the dams. And I had done all the QC for the system's crosswalks, made sure everything was delivering correctly. We no longer need those local assets because they are safely stored and preserved in our dams. On the access side, during our post-CDIS QC, I want to make sure that everything is working correctly with our object and our archival systems. We do use a different CIS for objects than we do for the archives. And so the CDIS matches them up a little bit differently. On my next slide, I'm going to walk you through the entire CDIS procedure, so I'm not going to go too in depth right now. But it allows us to do, the CDIS allows us to do a lot with automation for access. Like I said, mentioned earlier, I'm a rights and reproduction specialist as well. So I work on rights reviews for some of our objects. Our system of record is our CIS for objects and our CIS for the archives. And so in the object CIS, that's where I put all of the rights information that I've recorded. So we also have a non-automated asset delivery, AKA image requests. At NMAAHC, you can email a resource email address, and I'm one of the team who responds to those requests, whether that's someone internal, maybe someone in our own public affairs department, or somebody outside of the museum ever at a different Smithsonian unit who wants access to an image, or if it's somebody external to the Smithsonian completely who would like access to maybe video or images. We all get to the same point in the resource email account, and I'm one of the team that responds to those. So I do a lot in imaging, digitization, and access on a daily basis. The CDIS process. This is where I've heard in a lot of sessions and speaking with a lot of people that having one system of record is really important. You don't want to have to be manually updating information in your dams as well as in your CIS or your CMS. So on this slide, I have a timeline running from left to right. And the first step is to ingest assets to dams. With that timeline marker, I have a pair of white ice skates. It is collection object 2016.38.2 AB. So I ingest my assets to dams. Everybody does that. But I need to make sure that the next step on the timeline works, that my CDIS trigger criteria has been met. With the CDIS trigger criteria, I have an advertising card to a baseball event honoring Wilbur the Bullet Rogan, 2012.46.55.7. So the trigger criteria that we use at NMAAHC for the CDIS is that the name of the file or in our IPTC title field embedded matches the record name in our CIS. That's the first trigger, and it could be either of the two. The second trigger is that in our DAM system, I have the asset named as export for delivery service, yes. Our export for delivery service gives us two options, internal or external, and that doesn't matter. As long as I have marked the asset export for delivery service, yes, and the file name or the IPTC title field matches the CIS record, then my CDIS trigger criteria has been met. Next on the timeline, the DAMS sends the asset info to the CIS. Here I have an image of an open case holding an Ambro type image of a young Black man dressed as a Civil War soldier, 2008.9.2. So what the DAMS does is it tells the CIS, hey, I just got this asset, and it matches up with a record that you have in the CIS. The CIS then creates a media rendition and goes, oh, thanks. Here's some GUID, a global unique identifier. Here's some GUID information. DAMS goes, great. Thank you so much. Next step is that the CIS sends a lot of the rest of the metadata on that object to the DAMS. With that timeline marker, I have a brown textile with a geometric pattern 2017.108.3. So it doesn't just send the GeoID isn't just made during this process. It also sends information such as the object name that's in the catalog record. It sends the description of the object. It sends rights information if that is in the object record. And so all of this metadata comes over into the DAMs that I didn't have to put there manually. Our catalogers have put it in. Maybe I or the other rights specialist has put it into the CIS already. And then the last section, the last timeline marker is that the live metadata sync continues for the lifetime of the link. And with this timeline marker, I have a decorative wrought iron piece with swirls and curlicues, 2017.108.24.4. All of those numbers that I read are collection object numbers. I did want to make sure you know they are all open access objects. You can look them all up on our website and download them as you'd like. But the live metadata sync never breaks unless I purposefully break it by removing the media renditions on the collection object record and or deleting the asset out of the DAMs. So until that comes, anything that we update in our CIS automatically gets updated into the DAMs. Now that doesn't cover every single field that is in the CIS, but it covers the ones that we at NMAAHC have chosen that we want to put into the DAMs. CDIS is a system that's offered by our central DAMs team. And so all of the different units at the Smithsonian that use the DAMs and have a CDIS process, we call it a CDIS project, synced up, they could choose different metadata fields to sync over. And they could choose different triggers. So it's a process that is really museum specific, but it is something that a lot of the digital asset managers at a lot of the different units utilize. I almost lost my voice this morning, so I do apologize for how I sound.
You're doing great. Fantastic. In fact.
Sorry, 1 second. Okay, on my next slide, thank you. On my next slide, I have governance and policy. There are no images on this slide. Documentation for days, because don't we all? I work on updating current documentation. Everything that I do with documentation is with a working group. I am not a team of one, and I'm very lucky in that. Many digital asset managers are, so good on you. We create new documentation either as we need it or proactively. We sometimes do it based on Smithsonian-wide projects or initiatives. Sometimes they're based on what NMAAHC needs. Sometimes it's based only on what OCA needs, or sometimes even just inside of the Digi team. We've determined that a policy or a procedure or workflow that we already have in place doesn't cover everything that we need to. This week in particular, we're working on a new DAMS ingest workflow for study collection PDCOs. I'll have a slide in a moment on PDCOs, but they are primary digital collection objects. So that's, of course, when you get a collection object and it's only digital. So study collections is one tier of our collections. We have accessioned collections, study collections, and research files. Well, we didn't previously have a standard way of putting the study collection ones into the DAMs. We already had a standard for the accessioned collections, but not the study collections. So that's the documentation we're working on this week. Last week, I did send on a digital asset management plan for our accessioned collections and related assets up to the head of digitization and cataloging for final reviews before we get signatures to finalize the digital asset management plan. And that plan covers things we were already doing, but we just didn't have it in documentation form. So I do a lot of documentation. Some weeks it's a lot, some weeks it's a little. Next up, the next slide, I have PDCO management. Again, PDCO stands for primary digital collection objects. The picture that is on the slide is a screenshot of a terminal window after running a script. So what I do as the digital asset manager, since we don't have a digital collections specialist in our collections management office, I help manage the receipt and transfer of digital objects to the museum from donors or from donors. And so I do a review on assets. I help the registrar register the assets. In normal physical collections, the registrar would receive objects and they would go ahead and give them a temporary receipt number, a TR number. But that's not, our registrars don't have the digital preservation or digital knowledge that I have in how to make sure that the transfer is successful, there's no corruption going on, that we haven't lost any bits in the transfer, that we haven't gotten any viruses accidentally in the transfer. During the pandemic, it's all been over internet transfer. But before the pandemic, we were getting thumb drives. We've previously received DVDs with files burned on. And so as the digital asset manager in OCA, I'm filling this need to make sure that all of our PDCOs come to the museum and have a safe digital life. I also work with the curatorial team and cataloging to make sure that they have access to all the files. Sometimes we get files that they just can't handle or that their computers can't handle. For instance, not everybody has a license to Adobe Illustrator. So they need access copies and I provide that. And we do a lot before we actually accession. We obviously want to receive the files before we accession them because until we accession them, we don't own them. So I'll do a baseline digital preservation, asset preservation before we accession, and after accession is when we're allowed to put it in the dams. We can't put it in the dams before we own it because once it's in the dams, it's very hard to delete, as every dam system should be. And it's probably in three copies in 5 different places. So we don't put it into the dams until it has been fully accessioned. So that's kind of what I do in a day. And like I said before, I have done something from every single slide today, even though this is a conference day. This slide that you see here says questions, ? You can contact me. My email address is andrewsj@si.edu. I have added alt text to all of these slides. So if you do need to receive the PowerPoint with alt text, please feel free to email me and I will send you this slideshow. The last slide is image credits, and it is all of the object numbers that I read out on the CDIS slide, also letting you know that they are all open access licenses. Thank you so much.
That was spectacular, Judith. That was spectacular. That was as compelling as any reality TV show. And if you're joining this session late, you're wondering what on earth I'm talking about. That was a beautifully described process. Thank you very much. There are some questions. I actually have one, which is, can you describe the moment when you either hit delete or dragged that 1.1 terabyte of images into the trash can? Because I think that is so cathartic for many people listening.
It is. So that process is not a single hit. A part of our procedure is I do an extra QC. I make sure it's everywhere that it needs to be. It's delivering, it's in the dams, because sometimes it's not delivering on purpose. If it was event photography or exhibition photography, those are files that we only store in the dams for future retrieval. And so I make sure everything is where it needs to be. And then I usually break it up into like maybe 200 gigabytes at a time. And I hit delete, and then I go make a cup of tea while I'm waiting for it to process. Just as enjoyable,
even broken up. Right. So you're prolonging the emotional release. I love that.
Yes.
Okay. So and actually there was a question about your how often are you purging kind of on a weekly basis. So I think you covered that. Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say we do it on a quarterly basis.
Quarterly basis. Okay. So a couple of quick questions. Pat Seymour asks, how many units at the Smithsonian use dams? Is it one pool of assets? Because you talked about delivering to multiple units and multiple collections information systems, which is even more alarming.
There are at least 32 units that use the dams. So everybody knows the thing that pops out of everybody's mouth when you're talking about the Smithsonian is 19 museums, research centers, the zoo. And so that's not every unit of the Smithsonian. OCIO, our technology unit is a unit. Smithsonian Gardens is a unit. They take care of all the landscaping outside of all of the museum buildings. So it's at least 32. I don't know the exact number, but we had a meeting this morning and there were at least 32 units using the dams.
Impressive, nonetheless. There's a question from Catherine Gronsbell. You mentioned part of your responsibility area is related to rights information. Is rights information managed entirely in the dams or consumed from another system? What rights challenges have you noticed are unique to NMAAHC among the Smithsonian units?
So we do manage rights at the object level. So every asset that is synced to the object record is going to receive those rights. And it's a really great question because last year we rolled out a new sensitivity guidelines to follow because NMAAHC specifically has a lot of collections that today are racist and offensive. They may have to do with hate groups and violence. We do have some KKK collections. And so we have all these sensitivity guidelines that, along with actual copyright, which everybody has to deal with that, we have a 3-tier system for sensitive level 1, sensitive level 2, and sensitive level 3. And so we do treat those differently, both in how we treat the digital assets, but as well as how we handle the physical object. Level 3, when I put it into dams, it gets a security policy where nobody can see it. Myself and a very small other group of people can, and then until the curator of record says, okay, this information, this record that we have of this object can go public because we are doing an educational something along with making that object information public. That's when I'll switch the security policy so that other people can even see that those assets exist. We don't want something that's very sensitive. Maybe somebody was wearing something when they passed away. We want to make sure that we're always sensitive to living relatives. We want to make sure that we're sensitive to communities. And so those rights are more sensitive, are something that we deal with on top of the regular copyright issues.
Okay. Kind of on the continuing on the rights, there was a question about, this is a fantastic system. You have these very clear processes and policies, workflows in place. But there's a question about what happens if the metadata is complete, say copyright isn't present. Can you add it back? I think you talked about this very rigorous kind of review process, but can you send it back into the collection system?
There's no, we could update it in the collection system and then it would update into dams.
Oh, okay.
Our collection system is the system of record. So if I were to, in the description field on the dams metadata level in the dams, if the CDIS was working, had already synced, and our CIS was already delivering information, I could go in there and edit it. But then the next time the CDIS ran, it would overwrite my edits.
Gotcha.
So it's a live system.
Okay. There's a lot of interest in the sensitivity levels. It's a question about explaining levels 2 and 1, but also, is there any guide available? Bridget Supernova, what a fantastic name. Is the sensitivity guide available to the public, or may they contact you for private internal use, maybe with an NDA?
I do not know if it has been made publicly available yet. I can ask and you can email me your information and we may or may not be able to share it. But level 1 are going to be objects that are less, it's a level 1 is something that you might consider less sensitive. Level 1 objects are actually allowed to become open access. And so those might be, something like racist or offensive imagery, maybe a doll or an old advertising card where someone's in blackface, something that might be a little less offensive. I mean, it's all offensive, but something that doesn't reach the level of, a rope that was used during a lynching. So sensitive level 2 is in the middle. That's definitely where we put all of the PII, the personally identifiable information. We're not going to put out someone's fingerprints. That's personally identifiable information there that can be used to steal someone's identity. So something like PII is going to be in the level 2, where we're never going to make that open access, but it doesn't need the high security that a level 3 does. We are definitely going to redact PII when it's necessary and put those images out. But we're never going to make that open access either. So that's kind of the continuum from level 1. And there are assets there are objects that don't have any sensitivity level. We have tea kettles in the collections, or we have agricultural objects like a hoe, or none of those are things that are never going to receive a sensitivity level rating. So we have the whole.
So we are at time, but this is a fascinating and a truly brilliant presentation, Judith. And I think we all got a lesson into how to provide and give a much more accessible presentation. So thank you for that. I think maybe one last question, which I know a lot of us struggle with, is how do you treat image file sets meant to be kept together, or maybe advanced imaging files, 3D models, for example, in your dams? How do you treat those?
Yes, we do actually have a couple of those. We have recently accessioned a 3D model, and that's comprised of many files. I can't ingest all of those individually because the DAMS doesn't know what to do with them. I have zipped them and bagged and zipped the files and put that in the DAMS, but we are lucky that the Digitization Program Office at Smithsonian is working on a 3D specific DAMS-like repository that will know exactly what to do with all of the individual 3D model data files. But we did also recently accession a cover design for Elle Decor magazine. And again, with that, we received an Adobe Illustrator file, an Adobe Photoshop file, 3 font files, and 1 package.txt. So with that, I created a reference TIFF from the Illustrator, so that because none of those file types are what our CDIS can pick up. I did forget to mention the CDIS can only link back certain file types. And so I created a preservation TIFF from all of those. And that's what the CDIS is using. And then I zipped and bagged all of those files together and put them in the DAM.
Right. Gotcha. Okay, I think we should probably wrap up. This again, Judith, thank you so much for sharing that. That was a fascinating amount of detail you shared in a very accessible way. And that does bring us to the conclusion of this 2-day event. I'd like to thank everybody who's here for attending this inaugural Heritage Collections Management Conference. Be sure to stay tuned for one next year. I'll remind you that the platform is open for another 48 hours to rewatch sessions. A lot of the sessions go up immediately, so you can review those. You'll get to them by the agenda tab. I encourage you, while you're on the platform, to shamelessly take advantage of the fact that all your peers and colleagues from across the world are here. So everyone, take advantage of that networking opportunity right now. I'd like to thank, huge thanks actually and congratulations to the Henry Stewart team for putting this on. I know it's late where they are, and here on the West Coast, it's not even lunchtime. A huge thanks to our sponsors. There is still time to show your appreciation by visiting the exhibitions tab. And the sponsors are the reason that these conferences can be put on, and that the Henry Stewart can waive fees for the GLAM community. So please pay attention to the sponsors. I think that's it. Thank you to everyone for joining. I hope you found the last 2 days as informative and interesting and engaging as I did. And hopefully we will see you in a couple of months' time in real life, IRL, in London or New York. So thanks everyone for joining.